I almost didn't take the job that sent me to her door. I came to collect a debt her dying father couldn't pay, and I expected a short trip, a hard conversation, and a long drive home. What I found was a woman who refused to beg, and an offer I never saw coming. She looked me straight in the eye and proposed something that would keep me on that farm far longer than I planned. I told myself it was just business, but I was wrong about that, the way men usually are when they think their hearts aren't involved. People in the city knew me by a name I never gave myself. They called me the man with the ledger, because I was the one who showed up when the money ran out and the letters stopped working. I worked for a man named Hale, and Hale lent money to people who had nowhere else to turn, and when they couldn't pay, he sent me. I wasn't the kind who threatened, and I didn't need to be. Standing there, quiet, with the folder in my hands, did what silence always does to a person who already knows they're out of options. There's a certain weight to a man who won't raise his voice, and I had learned to use it the way a carpenter uses a level, steady and patient and almost kind. Being good at a thing that makes people close their doors a little faster isn't the same as being good, and that distinction should have worried me more than it did. I told myself it was enough. By the time I turned 51, I lived alone in a one-bedroom place above a dry cleaner, and I had stopped asking myself the hard questions somewhere around the time the quiet became the only company I kept. I hadn't always been this way. There had been a woman, years back, someone who filled the apartment with the smell of bread and the sound of a radio left on. For a little while, I had let myself believe that kind of warmth was something I could keep. She left the way people leave quiet men, gently and without a scene, and afterward I decided that wanting less was the same as hurting less. It wasn't, but it took me a long time to learn that. Let me tell you what a man like me comes home to, and it isn't much. The lamp on a timer switches on before I reach the door. The plate from the microwave waits on the counter, and my keys make the only sound in the room. A routine held me together the way a fence holds back a field, and you don't notice it's working until the day it isn't there. Most nights I ate, washed the one dish, and sat in the dark until the quiet felt normal again. That's a strange thing to get used to, the sound of no one waiting. But a man can get used to almost anything if he gives it enough years. Keeping your word and keeping your distance had come to mean the same thing to me. I had decided that a man who does his job and asks for nothing is doing about as well as a man can do. I built my whole life on that idea, the way you build a house on a foundation you never bother to check. I had believed in something softer once, a long time ago. Life teaches you to put the softer things in a drawer and forget which one you left them in. That morning, Hale called me into his office and slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an old loan, taken out years back by a man named Walt, who farmed a stretch of land 2 hours past the last paved road, and the letters had all come back unopened. Walt hadn't paid in over a year. Hale wanted me to drive out, see what the land was worth, and come back with a number or a signature. The drive out was long, and the buildings thinned until there was nothing but sky, wide and pale and quiet. I told myself this was just another folder, just another door. I had done this 100 times, and I knew the speech and the firm tone and the way to stand in a doorway so people understood I wasn't leaving empty-handed. What I didn't know, sitting in that truck with the heater on and the folder on the seat beside me, was that the door I was walking toward was the one that would change the shape of my whole life. Some doors are just doors. That one was the beginning of a story I never planned to be part of, and I was already on my way to it without the first idea of what was waiting. The city falls away slow when you drive far enough, and by the second hour the roads had turned to dirt and the sky had opened up like it does when there are no buildings left to hold it down. The smell came through the vent, turned earth and cold air and something green underneath, and I rolled the window down, because a man can only breathe recycled air for so long before he starts wanting the real thing. The folder sat beside me on the seat, the speech sat in my head, and I carried the quiet certainty that this would be over by supper time. Farms started appearing on both sides of the road, most of them small and tired, with barns that leaned a little and fences that had given up on being straight. I noted each one the way I always do, the worth of the land, the shape of the house, the signs of a place being held together by one stubborn person. That's the hardest part of my work, and the part I never said out loud. You learn to look at a person's whole life and reduce it to a number, and after enough years, the number is all you see. The folder said Walt's place was the last farm on the county road, past a creek and a stand of old oaks, and I almost missed the turn because the mailbox had fallen over into the weeds. The drive up was long and rutted, and the truck bounced over ground that hadn't been graded in years. A weathered house sat at the top of the rise, with a barn that needed paint and a few acres of struggling crops behind it, and it was poorer than I expected. I parked and sat there a minute, doing the math in my head, adding up what the land might bring at sale and subtracting what it would cost to get it there. Then I saw her. A woman stood on the porch with her hands on her hips, watching me come up the drive the way you watch weather rolling in, not afraid and not moving. She was brunette, with her hair pulled back, and she wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows and jeans worn pale at the knees. She didn't wave or call out, just waited for me to come to her, and something about that calm told me this wasn't going to be the conversation I had practiced in the truck. I have walked up to a lot of doors in my life, and most of the time the person on the other side is already shrinking before I get there. This woman wasn't shrinking. She stood in that doorway like she had been expecting this day for a long time and had decided in advance how she was going to meet it. I told myself to stick to the speech, keep it clean, get the number, and go. That's what I told myself, and I almost believed it. I didn't know yet what she was protecting, or what she was hiding behind that steady look. All I knew was that the folder in my hand felt heavier than it should have, and that the quiet on this farm was a different kind of quiet than the one I lived in. Mine was empty. Hers felt full of something she was holding together with both hands. She opened the screen door before I reached the steps, and she did it the way a person does when they have already decided to face the thing they fear. "You're from Hale," she said, and it wasn't a question. I told her I was, and she nodded once and held the door wide. "Then you better come in." The house was small and clean and worn in the way of a place that had been loved hard for a long time. The floors were swept, the curtains were straight, and every surface carried the faint shine of someone who wiped things down even when no one was coming. I could smell coffee, and under it the bitter smell of pills, and the warmth in the room came from a wood stove in the corner that someone had fed that morning. It was the kind of house that holds a person's whole history in its walls, and I felt it the second I stepped inside. She told me her name was Layla, and she said it the way you say a thing that needs no explanation. Then she walked me through the front room to a back bedroom where the light came in yellow through a window facing the fields. A thin man lay in the bed under a heavy quilt, awake but weak, and when he saw me, his face did the thing faces do when the worry they've been carrying finally shows up wearing a real face. "You must be the one he sent," Walt said, and his voice was kind and tired and a little embarrassed, the way a man's voice gets when he knows he owes something he can't pay. I sat in the chair Layla pulled up for me, and I opened the folder, and I told them plainly why I had come. The loan was real, and Walt knew it. He had taken the money years ago to keep the farm alive after his wife passed, and the crop had failed twice in a row. The interest had grown the way interest does, quiet and patient, until it owns more of you than you own of yourself. And now he was dying, and the money was never going to come, and he said so without making excuses. Layla stood against the doorframe with her arms folded, and she let her father talk. When he finished, she looked at me and said that there was no money, only the land, and the land was the only thing her father had left to give her. She wouldn't let it go. She said it without raising her voice, without tears, without any of the things I had seen 100 times in 100 other doorways, and that steadiness is what made me listen instead of reaching for the next line in my speech. I told her the debt had to be settled, that Hale wasn't a man who forgot, that the longer it sat, the worse it got. She heard me out, and then she said something that has stayed with me long after that day. She said she knew exactly what the debt was, and what it cost, and who it was owed to, and that knowing all of that wasn't the same as having the money to pay it. There was no self-pity in it. Her grieving was already done, and she had come out the other side standing up, and a person who has done that is harder to move than a house with its foundation set in rock. I sat there looking at the two of them, the dying father and the daughter who wouldn't break, and I felt the speech go quiet in my head. This was no longer a folder and a number. This was a collision between the job I came to do and two people who were worth more than the debt between them, and I didn't yet know which one was going to win. I stood up to leave, because leaving was the only move I had left that still made sense to me. I told them I would have to report back, that the land would have to be listed, that this was how it worked when the money couldn't come. It was the clean exit, the safe line, and I was already reaching for my coat when Layla said my name from the doorframe. She didn't ask me to sit back down. She told me she had a proposal, and she laid it out like something she had been turning over for a long time and had finally decided to set on the table. The farm needed 2 hands. Her father could no longer work, and she couldn't do it alone through the season. Her idea was that I stay, work the land alongside her, and let the labor itself pay down the debt until the harvest sold and the money could come. No cash would change hands until then. I stared at her, because on paper it made no sense at all. I was a debt collector, not a farmhand, and Hale wanted money, not tomatoes. The arrangement would tie me to this place for months, living in the same house as the people who owed the debt, doing work my body hadn't done in 30 years. My refusal was all lined up, neat and reasonable and final, and I opened my mouth to deliver it. Then Walt spoke from the bed, and what he said broke the line I had ready. He asked me to stay. Not for the debt, he said, but for her, because he knew he was dying, and he couldn't stand the thought of leaving her to carry the whole farm alone. His voice was thin, and it shook a little, and he was asking a stranger for the kind of help that has nothing to do with money. It was the first time in longer than I could remember that someone had asked me for something kinder than a payment. I stepped out onto the porch and called Hale on the phone, with the connection bad and the wind cold against my ear. He was quiet for a long second after I laid out the situation, and then he gave me a deadline. 3 months, he said. After that, he would send someone to take the land, and it wouldn't be someone who knocked first. I agreed to stay, telling myself it was only strategy, only a way to secure the debt and keep the farm from being sold out from under the deal. I walked back inside and told them I would stay through the season, and Layla nodded like she had expected nothing else. Walt closed his eyes and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for months, and the room got a little softer around the edges. I told myself I was still the man with the ledger, still doing a job, still keeping my distance. The arrangement was just business, and I said that to myself twice on the drive back to the city to get my things, as if saying it enough times could make it true. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was that the part of me which had been sitting in the dark, eating off a single plate for years, was already leaning toward this. I was leaning toward a house that smelled like coffee and a porch where someone waited. I packed a bag that night, and I told myself I was packing for the job, and I almost believed it. The first week nearly broke my body, and there's no honest way to tell it otherwise. The morning started in the dark, the cold bit through my coat before the sun came up, and the work used muscles I hadn't asked to do anything in decades. Layla showed me what to do without talking down to me, and she corrected me without cruelty. She had a way of handing me the right tool before I knew I needed it that made me feel like less of a fool than I probably was. We were two people who didn't yet trust each other, sharing a kitchen and a silence and a list of chores that never got shorter. I was formal with her, the way a man gets when he's keeping his distance, and she was direct with me, the way a woman gets when she has no patience for distance. We bumped against each other's habits in the small rooms, her music in the morning, my need for quiet at night, and neither of us gave easily. And yet the small things started to move between us, quiet and without names. She left coffee on the porch for me before I came out, still hot, in the mug with the chipped handle, and she never mentioned it. I fixed the barn door that had been swinging loose on one hinge for what looked like a season, and I did it on a Sunday when she was inside with her father, and I didn't mention it either. Neither of us named what those gestures meant, because naming them would have made them something we had to decide about, and neither of us was ready. I began to watch her, not on purpose, but the way you start to notice a person when you're near them every day and the work makes you move together. She carried the whole farm on her shoulders and hid the fear she carried about her father somewhere behind her eyes where she thought no one could see it. She still laughed in the evenings, at small things, at the dog chasing a leaf, at the way I held a hammer like I was afraid of it, and that laughter was the warmest sound the house had heard in a long time. Walt watched us from the window when he was well enough to sit up, and on the afternoons he felt stronger, he talked to me while Layla worked outside. He told me about the land, how he had cleared it himself the year he married, how the soil was stubborn but honest, how he had built the barn with his wife's father the summer before his daughter was born. Listening to him, I started to understand what this place meant to this family, that it wasn't acreage and a house, but the shape of a whole life laid down in rows. There was a moment, maybe 3 weeks in, when I came in from the field with my arms aching and my hands raw, and Layla had left a plate of bread and soup on the table with a note that just said, "Eat." I sat down and ate, and the kitchen was quiet, and the light was going gold outside the window, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. And if you've ever lived alone long enough to forget what it's like to be met at the end of a hard day, you understand why that small thing undid me more than any grand gesture could have. I didn't call it anything, but I knew, somewhere underneath the part of me that was still pretending, that the wall I had built wasn't as solid as it had been when I drove up that rutted road. There was another evening, not long after, when the rain came down hard and the two of us got caught bringing the last of the hay in, and we stood together in the barn doorway, soaked through and laughing at nothing in particular. She looked over at me with her hair stuck to her face and her eyes bright from the cold, and for a second I forgot that I was here for a debt at all. I forgot that I was supposed to be leaving. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and went back to work, and I stood there a beat too long before I followed her, and I knew that the pretending was getting harder to do. The 3 months Hale had given me felt both impossibly long and already too short, and I didn't want to think about what happened when they ran out. So I didn't think about it. I went back out the next morning, and the morning after that, and the work went on, and the farm slowly began to look like a place that had 2 people holding it up instead of 1. What I didn't know was that the thing which would finally break the story open wasn't the deadline or the money, but a quiet confession from a dying man that would change everything I thought I understood about why I was there. It was a quiet afternoon, maybe 5 weeks in, when Walt asked me to sit with him while Layla was out checking the far field. The light was low and yellow through the window, and his breathing was harder than it had been even a week before, and I could see he had something he wanted to say before he lost the chance. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he told me the truth about the loan. The money hadn't been for the farm, he said. The crop had been struggling, yes, but the loan came later, the year his wife got sick, and he took it to pay for her last months of care, when the savings were gone and the hospital bills kept coming. He kept the farm going after she passed because it was the only thing he had left to give Layla, and he made the payments as long as he could. Then he couldn't, and then he got sick himself, and the debt just sat there growing while his body did the same thing in its own slower way. I sat with that for a long minute, and the folder in my head, the one I had carried into this house, stopped being a folder. This debt had never been a man being careless or living beyond his means, the stories I told myself to make the work easier. It was a dying man, choosing his wife and then choosing his daughter, knowing it would cost him everything he had, and paying that price on purpose. I had spent my whole working life treating debts as simple transactions, a number owed and a number paid. Now I had to sit in a small bedroom and hold the fact that this one was an act of love dressed up in paperwork. Walt watched me take it in, and then he said something I have turned over many times since. He said he knew the debt was wrong by the measure of the ledger, but he would do it again, because a man who lets his wife suffer to keep his name clean isn't a man worth being. Then he asked me not to tell Layla he had explained it, because she already carried enough without knowing he had chosen her mother's comfort over the farm he meant to leave her. I gave him my word, and I sat with him until he fell asleep, and I walked out to the porch, feeling like the ground under me had shifted. All those years, all those doors, all those people who closed their faces when I showed up, and I had never once stayed long enough to learn what was behind the number I came to collect. I wondered how many of them had a story like this one, a reason that would have changed the shape of the conversation if I had only thought to ask. The thought didn't make me feel better about the work I had done. It made me feel like a man who had spent 30 years reading only the cover of a book and calling himself well-read. Layla found out I knew, later that same evening, the way people find things out in the small house when a silence carries a different weight than usual. She didn't defend her father or explain him. She just looked at me and said, quietly, that she would have done the same, and that her mother would have done the same for either of them, and that some debts are worth more than the things you lose to pay them. For the first time, I saw the full shape of what she was carrying, the farm and the father, and the memory of a mother who had been loved enough to go broke over. I understood that she was holding together a whole way of loving, not just a place. The stakes had moved. This was no longer about whether the debt got paid or whether the land got sold. It was about whether I could keep treating my own life as a transaction, a series of clean numbers with no warmth in them, or whether I was willing to become someone whose ledger had room in it for people. Hale called early on a Tuesday morning, and his voice had the flat sound it got when he had run out of patience. The 3 months were nearly up, he said, and he wanted the land listed for sale by the end of the week. I tried to talk him through the arrangement, the labor, the harvest that was coming in, the money that would come with it, and he cut me off the way he cut off everyone who brought him reasons instead of cash. He told me to come back to the city and bring the deed or the money, and if I came back with neither, he would send someone who would take the land the way he always took it, by force and by paper. I drove back to the city that afternoon, and the whole way I told myself this was the clean exit, the moment the story got simple again. I could do the job I was sent to do, hand Hale what he wanted, and go back to the apartment with the lamp on the timer and the one plate in the dish rack. It would be the safe choice, the familiar choice, the choice that asked nothing of me that I hadn't already given up asking for. Hale met me in his office, and he reminded me what I was, in that careful way he had of making a threat sound like a favor. He said I didn't get to go soft on a debtor. That sentiment wasn't in their line of work. That a man who starts feeling for the people he collects from is a man who has stopped being useful. Then he gave me 1 week. After that, the farm was no longer my problem. It was his, and he would solve it the way he always solved things. and I knew exactly what that meant for Walt and Layla. I left his office and sat in my truck in the parking lot, and the full weight of the life I had built pressed down on me in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. The apartment waiting for me was quiet and clean and empty, and the thought of going back to it felt like putting on a coat that no longer fit. Somewhere in the last 3 months, without deciding to, I had started calling the farm home in my head, and I hadn't even noticed it happening until this moment made the difference sharp. I drove back toward Hollow Creek with the radio off and the window down, and the dirt road felt different under the tires, less like the way into a job and more like the way back to something I had been missing. The old life was pulling at me from one side, safe and familiar and cold, and the farm was pulling from the other, harder and poorer and full of a warmth I had spent years pretending I didn't need. I didn't know yet which one was going to win, but I knew, sitting in that truck watching the fields open up again, that the man driving back wasn't the same man who had driven out. Somewhere out past the last paved road, a woman was waiting on a porch, and a dying man was waiting in a back room, and a farm was waiting for the hands it needed. For the first time in my life, I understood that being needed wasn't the same as being used. That evening, I found Layla on the porch, sitting on the old swing with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and she looked up at me, and I could see she already knew something had changed. She asked me plainly what Hale had said, the way she asked everything, without hedging or softening, and I sat down on the step beside her and told her the whole of it. The week I had left, the threat to take the land, the job I was supposed to go back and finish, all of it laid out in the cold air between us. She was quiet for a while, and the swing creaked a little in the wind, and then she asked me the question that stripped away every excuse I had left. She asked whether I would stay if there were no debt at all, if the ledger were closed and the farm owed nothing, and the only reason to stay was that I wanted to. I looked at her, and the honest answer came up before I could dress it in anything safer, and I said yes. I didn't give her a speech, because I didn't have one, and because the things that matter most rarely arrive in the shape of a speech. I told her I hadn't come here for the right reasons, that I came to take something, and instead I found the first place in years that felt like it wanted me in it. I wanted to stay for the right ones now. She didn't make it easy on me, and I respected her for that, because a woman who gives her trust away too fast is a woman who hasn't learned what it costs. Then she reached over and took my hand, and I let her, and we sat there on that porch with our fingers laced together, and the dark coming on, and the fields going quiet around us. It was the first real touch between us, held and not rushed, and it felt less like a beginning and more like arriving somewhere I had been walking toward my whole life without knowing the address. The ache I had carried for years, the one I had buried under routine and quiet, settled into something softer, right there on that step, and I let it. Inside, the light was on in Walt's room, and we didn't know he was watching from his bed, but later I learned that he smiled that night, for the first time in weeks. He knew, the way a parent knows, that the farm and his daughter wouldn't be left alone, that the man who came to collect had become the man who would stay. It gave him a peace I didn't fully understand until after he was gone. The next morning I drove back to the city, but this time I wasn't going as the man with the ledger. I walked into Hale's office and I told him I was done, that I was quitting, and that I was paying Walt's loan myself with the money I had saved in all those empty years. It was most of what I had, the slow savings of a man who never went anywhere and never spent on anything but the barest needs. I set it on the desk between us, like a man laying down a thing he no longer needed to carry. Hale looked at the money, and then he looked at me, and he told me I was a fool. He said I was throwing away a steady life for a woman I had known 3 months, and a farm that would never make me rich. I told him he was probably right about the money and wrong about everything else. I signed the papers that closed the loan, and I walked out of that office for the last time. The city felt different behind me, smaller and colder, like a place I had been stored in rather than lived in, and I didn't look back in the mirror as I drove away. Walt died 2 weeks later, quietly, in his own bed, with Layla beside him holding his hand and the window open to the fields he had spent his life tending. It wasn't a shock, because we had all been walking toward it, but it landed on her the way grief lands on a person who has been too strong for too long, heavy and late and final. I stayed through it. I held the farm together in the days when she couldn't, and I held her in the evenings when the house got too quiet. I learned that being useful to someone you love is a kind of prayer the body says without the mouth. The harvest came in late that year, and it was small, but it was enough. Layla and I ran the farm side by side, and the ledger that had brought me to her door was closed and put away in a drawer where neither of us looked at it again. Some mornings I wake before her and stand on the porch with my coffee, watching the light come up over the fields Walt cleared with his own hands, and I think about how close I came to never seeing any of it. The man who came to collect a debt found instead that the real debt was the one his own heart had been owed all along, the one that said he was allowed to stop keeping his distance from his own life. He paid it the only way it could be paid, by finally letting someone in. I still fix things around the farm that don't need fixing, and she still leaves coffee on the porch in the chipped mug, and the barn door I hung that first Sunday is still standing straight. I came to collect a debt, and instead I found the one person who collected me. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me which moment got to you most.